Tony, you're a solicitor, not only a human rights lawyer, but also a commercial lawyer.
That's right, yes.
And you chair the Human Rights Committee of the Law Society. You'll probably recognise that a leading politician once said that all a politician needs to do to maintain power is to make the people think they're under attack and to offer them safety. He said it works in all places at all times. That seems to be what's happening now. And of course, the person who said that was Hermann Goering at Nuremberg.
Well, these echoes from the past are reverberating because a lot of the circumstances which began to emerge in the 1930s are at some level emerging again around Europe now. The rising tide of nationalism, the sort of Brexit mentality of wanting to look after our own country ahead of anybody else. And that sort of propaganda is what has caused fear in the populations of many European countries.
How does the rest of the world view what Australia is doing, and how do we compare with other parts of the West?
Well, I think the consensus is that it's a very extreme response, and the most extreme response of any Western power. And when I initially read about the Pacific solution, I was shocked, and it takes quite a lot to shock me these days.
So how is it that Australia gets away with it in the international field?
Well, it seems to have adopted a policy of ignoring the international opinion, and the UN has solidly condemned the practice. A lot of NGOs have produced a series of reports, especially Amnesty International, which have expressed horror at the extent of the persecution that the asylum seekers are suffering. But it appears that those remedies which have been pursued have not been effective, and the Australian government has been able to ignore the findings of these international mechanisms, which is not good for the rule of law, obviously.
In your assessment, is Australia breaching its international human rights commitments under the various human rights conventions that we're party to?
Well, most certainly, I would say yes. And I think, the problem with a lot of international human rights are that there are very few effective mechanisms for enforcing them. And it's political pressure that really is the remedy in connection with a lot of international human rights instruments.
Yes. What has been the effect of political attitudes to human rights since the Brexit vote, the inauguration of Donald Trump and things of that sort?
Well, that's a very big question, isn't it? In the UK, certainly, there is a hardening of attitudes towards asylum seekers and immigration more generally. And there is a concern that the pioneering Australian attitude towards their international obligations could find its way across Europe and into America as a result of these changes.
Bizarre thinking, but it seems to work if the politicians stir it along a bit.
It's difficult to fathom exactly why there is such a change of attitude over a fairly short span of time. I think, 10 years ago, I think, was the sort of zenith of the human rights movement generally. And since 9/11, there has been a gradual rolling back of attitudes and a cultural change towards human rights, which is permeating through a lot of European countries and through the Americas as well.
The change in language that you see in UKIP, that seems likely to get worse because Donald Trump has now made it apparent that you can say whatever you feel like, no matter whether you believe it. You can say outrageous things and it's okay.
Well, of course. I mean, he's the leader of the free world now. And, it's a terrifying prospect if the leader of the free world is prepared to surrender the truth. And it's going to be a huge task for the rest of us to retain a focus on the truth and counter the alternative version of the truth that we may well hear from the Trump administration.
We've been there before, of course, with anti-Semitism in the 1920s, and then the world sort of drew back and held its breath after the Holocaust was exposed. And that did seem to lead to a great change in human rights thinking across the Western world. Will we have to descend to another Holocaust before we reach that same turning point?
Well, I was in Poland last weekend and I was thinking about exactly that question, really. How do we get our empathy back? What's being said nationally in the UK doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening in individual communities around the country. And I'm hopeful that there will be, over the next few years, a groundswell of opinion, notwithstanding Brexit, that we should be doing more. And I know a lot of people who are supportive of that idea.
So where do we go from here?
Well, we keep the flame alight. We try to encourage people to have a proper human experiences of asylum seekers so that they can feel some level of connection to them. We keep the rhetoric focused on the importance of the rights which were so hard fought for and so well understood to be needed after the Second World War.
We've departed a long way from that position.
It's 70 years now without a war in Central Europe. There are two generations who've lived their lives free of that sort of torment and terror. And there's been an evaporation of the sort of empathy and general understanding of what the current day asylum seekers are going through. How do we get it back? One answer is another world war, and nobody wants that.